Chapter 23, we're going to do in two parts, and you'll understand why after we get done with this first part today. To start with, on page 571, we just want to have an introduction to what the nervous system is and why it is so expansive and big. So first of all, the nervous system is our body's master communication system. It does work with the endocrine system, which will be chapter 24, in working to try to balance out our body and maintain a sort of normalcy, which is our homeostasis. The nervous system is fed in different ways from different hormones, different chemical messengers, some of those receptors that we had in the previous chapter. So it's all going to start to come into play as to what and why and how our nervous system is working. I do want you to notice that at the very bottom of this slide, I have that there's this table that's on page 571, but really you have to get through the entire chapter and then come back to this, and then this might help you. Some of these word meanings might help you, but when you look at this huge list now, it's just a bunch of words and aren't going to make a whole lot of sense. So let's look forward to coming back to that after you go through part 2 of chapter 23. The functions or the physiology of our nervous system, there's two on the bottom of page 571, the sensory input and the interpretive functions. The other two are on top of page 572, our motor output and our higher mental functioning and emotional responsiveness. So those functions you need to be aware of, or the physiology of our nervous system. The two parts of our systems of the nervous system, or the subcategories you can think of them, we have our central and peripheral nervous system. So this picture is on page 572. So you can see the green in the very center, our brain, our spinal cord. That is our central nervous system. It's in the central portion of our body. That might help you remember that. But then you can see the list of all of the things that our central nervous system is in charge of. Then we have our peripheral nervous system. So this is our cranial and our spinal nerves. So this is exiting out the brain and the spinal cord and going to everywhere else in our body. The two subsystems of the PNS, or peripheral nervous system, are the somatic and the autonomic. And then there's a further subdivision of sympathetic and parasympathetic. We're going to talk about each one of those separately, but you can see the brief definitions on page 572 just to get you introduced to those. This picture is what's on the bottom of page 573. And we had a little bit of this picture in chapter 18. We talked a little bit about the cell body and the axon. We also looked at it in chapter 20 when we were talking about how muscles move. So now we're going to dive in deeper to the cells that are within the nervous system. So remember, every body system is just the like cells that come together to make up that type of tissue. So in this case, we're going to look at one individual cell, and the cells within the nervous system are called the neuroglia and the neurons. The neuroglia, or the glial cells, is the connective tissue that is supporting, nourishing, protecting, and insulating the cell, the neuron itself. And there is some extra parts on page 573 of the neuroglia, or the glial cells, that I want you to be aware of. And those are in the mid part of this slide, the myelin sheath and the myelin. I want you to be aware of where those are located within the glial cell, or the neuroglia. the white and the gray matter is what's up next. The white and the gray matter picture is actually from further back in this chapter, what I have pictured here. It's on page 581, but it makes sense for me to put it right by the white and the gray matter. Obviously, they have different colors, but they're also part of what is happening within the neuroglia. So the white matter is where the cell body is located. I'm sorry, the gray matter is where the cell body is located, and the white matter is where the nerve fiber is located. So it's just easier to see it when you look at the picture of it. So we just finished talking about one of the type of cells that the nervous system contains, and that's the neuroglia, or the glial cell. So now we're going to look at the neuron as the other type of cell. So this is the impulse conducting cell. This is the simplest part of the nervous system. So the neuroglia, or the glial cell, is the connective tissue that was supporting, nourishing, protecting, insulating. This is the one that is in charge of movement. You could think of it that way. So it's the impulse conducting cell. The parts that are listed on page 573 and pictured on the bottom of 573, we have the cell body, the dendrite, and the axon. So the cell body is just the part that is containing the nucleus. It has the dendrite and the axon attached to it. The dendrite is what is extending out, and when you look at that, it kind of looks like a branch. So it has to receive and send stimuli and impulses. So maybe you can think of that. The branch might help you think of that. And the axon has to send that impulse out to somewhere else. So it's transmitting that nerve impulse away from the cell body, and it has the telodendria, which is an extra part coming off, which is leading to our synaptic bulb, and that has the synaptic vesicles. So it looks like dynamite is where the synaptic bulb is. You can think of it that way, which has those, looks like feet, the telodendria sticking on top of that dynamite. So those are all located as part of that axon that they've magnified and shown in that picture on the bottom of 573. Okay, so the nervous system has two types of cells, the neuroglia and the neurons. So the neurons is what was pictured on the bottom of 573. But we further have to classify the functions and the structures of the neuron itself. And that is dependent upon a couple different things. So we're going to have our prefixes come into play again, the uni, the bi, and the multi. So it depends on how many branches there are, or polars or poles that are extending out of that cell body. So if you look at that picture on the bottom of 573, you can see that those branches, those dendrites, have different poles coming out of them. Uni, bi, and multipolar, just those amount of poles that are coming out. But the next part might seem a little bit more confusing, but it kind of makes more sense. So it's the number of poles, but then also there's going to be directions of where, just like our roads, like where that pole is going to be sending that information out to. So the classifications of the functions of the neuron on 574, we have the afferent, which is going towards the central nervous system. The efferent is going away from the central nervous system. And then we have the interneurons, which are the association ones. They're lying in between the sensory and the motor neurons. and they're helping take part in our decision making. So if you kind of think of it of a road, you're going to have some that are going towards from somewhere, some that are coming away from somewhere, and then something that's going to help you be right in that middle. Maybe it's like a roundabout. It's going to help with your decision making. So those are the functional classifications of the neuron. And then we have the number of poles that are coming out of the neuron. And just remember, the neuron is the impulse conducting cell, and that is one of the two parts of cells or types of cells that are contained in the nervous system. We have the neuroglia and the neurons. So we spend a little bit more time on the neurons because those are the ones that are involved with action. And speaking of action, we have how an action actually happens. We have our reflex thought process. We all know what a reflex is. It's a protective response. If you've ever had a bug crawl on your skin, it's kind of an automatic reflex to like try to flick it off, brush it off, do something to get rid of it. So that's a reflex. It's a protective, involuntary, and predictable response to something that is happening. But a reflex arc is simply how this actually happens. So if you look at the picture that's on page 574, you can see that it looks like you've taken a finger, you've done a pain-provoking stimulus, you've touched something that is sharp. The afferent is going to, if you follow that up, it went up to your brain. So it's transmitting the sensory information towards my brain. I've touched something that is sharp. So then we're going to have our interneuron. It's going to help me process, is that painful or is it not type thing. And then the efferent neuron is going to transmit that impulse away from the central nervous system back down to my finger that gives us that motor response that says, oh, take my finger off that painful thing. So the reflex happens, but it's the reflex arc that is making that happen. And it's an easy thing to think of. We touch something that is sharp or hot or cold, but we don't think of how all of that, all the neurons that were involved with that action. When we have that reflex and that reflex arc occur, there's bundles of fibers that are laying across many different systems that have to help all of that information come in. So that's the tract of the nerve. So the tract is located in the central nervous system, and the nerve is located within the peripheral nervous system. So if you go back and look at that picture on page 572, you see the green and the yellow. Remember, there is a difference. So there has to be a connective way. There has to be a tract that gets to where it needs to go. But there is layers of connective tissue within that nerve that is helping to conduct that. So for this, the picture I have on the slide here is what's pictured on the left-hand side of 575. And what I want you to notice is the endoneurium. So endo being our prefix, it means the inside. And then just look at how that yellow and blue connective tube is coming out of the purple fascicle. The fascicle is that one big bundle. We had that back in chapter 20 in our muscle layer. So the endo is what's around those fibers, which is around the fascicle. We have the peri, which is another prefix that if you don't know, I want you to look up. And then the other one is going to be epi. So endo, peri, and epi, those are ones that are going to keep, those prefixes are going to keep coming back in. But we want to look at each one of those tissue layers and know where they are located within that nerve itself. So what we're looking at on that 23.4 view, or what I have on the slide, that's one nerve, which is just a bunch of them all connected all throughout our body. So the endo, peri, and epineurium are just part of the connective tissue layers that are within the nerve and those tracks that are making the reflex arc, which is making that reflex happen, which is taking that information into our brain and back out of our brain. Now we are going to look at how the nerve impulse actually happens. And it's very complicated. It's not just, oh, I touched something that was sharp and now I need to take my finger away. Well, of course not. There's definitely more involved in that. There is a nerve impulse, an electrical current or signal that has happened that has to tell that neuron, that impulse thing, that impulse cell to do something. So a nerve impulse is just that electrical signal that has happened. Neurons, so that type of cell, can transmit impulses to other neurons or out to a muscle or out to a gland, but it also can secrete a chemical or a neurotransmitter. In the second part of this chapter, we'll talk more about that. But what I have up here on the slide is what's pictured on the right-hand side of 575, so it'll be a little bit clearer. And what it's showing you is what polarization, depolarization, and on page 576, we'll go on into repolarization. So sometimes having the pictures right next to the definitions is helpful. So what we want to look at, if you look at that very top part of that figure, you can identify the cell body, the dendrites, and the axon. And so now we're going out into the direction of the impulse. So if you compare the picture that's on the bottom of 573 with what's on the right-hand side of the top of 575, that's where we're looking at. So polarization is part of the nerve impulse that is describing what the neuron is doing when it's doing nothing. It's resting. It's not conducting an impulse. It's just sitting there. It's just sitting there on the couch, right? So that's polarization. And part of sitting there means there is action potential to happen. Something could happen, or it could end up sitting there the whole time. But polarization is a sodium-potassium pumping balance. So part of what we have going on within each cell is the membrane potential and the action potential, which is a sodium-potassium pumping balance. So maybe you've heard of, I want to be in balance. I want to balance out the inside of my body. We're talking about the inside of one cell that this polarization thought process is happening. So next we have depolarization. So this neuron has received a message to do something, to get up off the couch or to make some sort of potential action happen. It had the potential and now we're calling it in to do something. So the sodium that is inside that cell is going to cause a movement or a negative charge to go to a positive charge. So this is depolarization. And once this impulse begins, there's no going back. It's either all or none. It has started. It's got to finish. So polarization sitting on the couch, then it receives some little stimulus, maybe it's a chemical reaction, maybe it's some other form, and it says, okay, now I actually need to do something. I need to move or go from being negative to positive, and that's my depolarization. And once I start this action, the membrane potential will continue without fluctuations and without a decrease in how it is moving. That is that all or none response. And then repolarization has to occur. So repolarization is where that neuron, that cell, quickly resumes back to its resting state or back to its polarized state. But as that is happening, there is a refractory period. So it's a brief period to where that little membrane can't be called in. So if someone was to stop you when you were sitting down on the couch, it might be difficult depending on where you're at to stop. You might just be like, okay, let me get all the way down and then I can get back up or go back to polarization. So all of the nerve impulses that are transmitted along those tracts of the neuron nerve, it does have an action process that it has to go through, and that is that sodium potassium moving in and out of our cell, or that negative and that positive. And this is just a brief overview of how all of this is happening. It's just an introductory level. You just need to be aware of how a cell is called into response. So not getting too deep, not getting too technical, just understand polarization, depolarization, and repolarization. However, so at the very bottom of the slide, we have two different types of conduction. This is on the left-hand side of 576. We have the nerve impulse conductions that are continuous and saltatory. So continuous means it's continuous. The impulse is transmitted along an unmyelinated axon. So you might need to turn back a couple pages if you're not sure what that means. But then the saltatory is when the impulse transmission is along the myelin axon. So it's different. The nerve impulse can go and jump along the lengths. So that is better seen in the picture on the bottom of 573. If you want to look back at that, you can see how between the yellow and the blue, jumping can happen. So that's just talking about something that could occur. So a leap can occur as it's going along the length of that axon. So there can be like little hiccups in how our cell is moving. Our neuron, which is our impulse conducting cell within the nervous system, it does have to further make something happen. So the synaptic transmission is what we're going to look at as the last part of this first part of this chapter. So remember I said we were going to break this down into two parts. So this is what's pictured on the top of 577. The information is on 576, so it's a little bit easier. They kind of put it in the book close so you can see things. But I just want you to see an overview that there is numbers on the right-hand side in yellow, the 1, 2, and 3. So that might help you keep track of what is happening. And what is happening in this picture is when a signal is transmitted between two neurons, or between a neuron and a muscle, or a neuron and a gland, there has to be some sort of signal that is going forth, either as a chemical messenger to send out potentially maybe a hormone or something to happen, or it could be an electrical action to happen. So an electrical action is what would happen in my heart. So I want my heart to keep beating, so that type of thing. And then again, a chemical could be a hormone. Could be, doesn't have to be. So we want to look at this transmission from the fact of what is electrically or chemically happening as it moves forward. Within this transmission, we have 3 steps that are going to hopefully potentially happen. The impulse is going to travel from the cell, or it's going to come in through the dendrite into the cell body, out through the axon, and that nerve impulse is going to travel down the axon to come to the very end. So if you look at the picture on the bottom of 573, we're going all the way out to the end, and now we're out to the very end of this bulb. That's what we're looking at. So the nerve impulse has arrived. It's coming down here somewhere. So this is going to be transmitting potentially this cell, this neuron out to a muscle or into a gland. So that's the part that's happening, and the blue part with the purple bulbs, the purple blue bulbs with the green balls in between it. They are showing you neurotransmitters. Those are the chemical messengers. So we're just seeing that because electrical obviously would be a little different. But those neurotransmitters that are in those little balls, they have to travel across that gap, that synaptic gap, in order to get into a binding site, which is part of the plasma membrane, which hopefully then is going to send it out to that muscle or go out to that gland. So this is just showing how in a chemical messenger, so if it's a hormone that is being produced as part of a chemical, that I need to do that somewhere out in my body. The electrical impulse works the same way. It's just easier to show it with the chemical or the neurotransmitters. An electrical impulse is, again, our heart. So our heart is beating all the time. The same type of action has happened. It's just that it's an electrical signal. When the chemical does not take, there is a process that is hopefully going to happen. That chemical, we can't just let it fly willy-nilly out into our body. We're hoping that it's going to be removed or sent back into our environment by enzymes or a reuptake process. It's going to be reabsorbed. So our body is very efficient, and when we fire something, we want it to happen. But if it doesn't for whatever reason, hopefully it's going to be absorbed and it can try again.